Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years, Harris Ranch Resort, providing Western hospitality and award-winning cuisine, The Wonderful Company, committed to growing a better world, Comcast, connecting people to the moments and experiences that matter most, Producers Dairy, nourishing one life at a time, and Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Cook Land Company and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Blake Zante.
Welcome to the Maddy Report. I'm Blake Zante, Executive Director of the Maddy Institute and host of the Maddy Report. Today we're sitting down with City Attorney for the City of Fresno, Andrew Janz, to discuss his role and some of the recent things facing the City Attorney's Office. Mr. Janz, thanks for joining the Maddy Report today. Really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me, Blake.
Great. Well, let's dive right in. To begin with, I'd like to know a little bit about your role as Fresno City Attorney. How does your role work, within the greater legal system within the city, with the City Council, and, just kind of maybe walk us through what sorts of issues you work on day to day as City Attorney.
Yeah, structurally my job is very interesting in that I report to a City Council of 7. They hired me back in December of 2022, almost a year and a half ago. So I directly report to them. But ultimately my client is the City of Fresno, so I do legal work for the mayor and the city manager as well. So everyone gets a fair shot at the legal advice that I give, but it's always important for me to remember at the end of the day I have 7 bosses.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure that's an interesting dynamic that you have to juggle with as City Attorney. But let's talk a little bit about your transition process into this role. I know at first you were, working for the Fresno County District Attorney's Office. There were some news reports that came out that said you would make a great City Attorney. Initially, you kind of shied away from it, and then you ended up accepting the post. Talk a little bit about that. What was the change of heart into this role?
I will never forget my time at the Fresno County District Attorney's Office. Being a prosecutor was very rewarding, especially when you're out there every day on the front lines fighting for justice for victims of some of the most serious crimes. In my last assignment, before becoming City Attorney, I was on the sexual assault unit. And I had, at that time, a number of high-profile, very important cases that I wanted to see through. And so it wasn't really the right time for me then. I've always wanted to lead an office of my own, but it didn't feel right leaving some of those victims behind. And so as soon as I wrapped up some of those cases, I know another opportunity came up closer to the end of the year, and I sat down with my wife and my family and made the decision to apply.
And talk a little bit about, now that you've been in this role, what are some of the things that you've learned throughout the process? Just kind of day to day, is there anything that's different, being a city attorney versus being in the district attorney's office or other legal practices?
What I can say is when I was first appointed by the city council, I was asked to be a more transparent city attorney, to be a city attorney that was innovative and forward thinking. And so those are the things that I bring to the job every day. I want to make sure that we aren't doing things just because we've always done them. We want to have creative solutions to the very complex problems that we see in our community, and I think that that my office has done that well in the last year and a half. And so what I strive to do is to make sure that in terms of working with members of the community, because remember, my office is in charge of doing Public Records Act requests, and so that is a key component to being the city attorney, is being as transparent as you can with the public in accordance with the law.
Let's talk a little bit about that. That's something I've noticed as a recent change. You've been kind of made it more of a focus as your role as city attorney to be more visible, be more accessible, be more transparent with the public. What are some of the changes that you've implemented as city attorney to be able to meet those goals and expectations?
Yeah, and so I think that's a good, very important point. The city attorney's office, a lot of people don't know all of the great things that our office does, and we can talk a little bit more about some of those things later. But for example, the city attorney's office oversees code enforcement. You know, this is a unit of over 100 employees that go out there and enforce the municipal code on a daily basis. And so the public has a right to know what our office is doing. And secondly, when I came to work at the city attorney's office, I found out very quickly that the people that have been working there for years are dedicated, lifelong public servants who work really hard and have the best interests at heart. And part of what I'm doing in being more accessible to the media is being able to showcase some of the great work that my staff is doing.
That's great. And we'll talk a little bit, you mentioned code enforcement. We'll dive into some of the issues here in the upcoming segments. Up next, we'll talk more about some of the recent legal and legislative changes that have affected the city. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Mr. Janz, I want to dive into some of the topics, a little, revolving the recent legislative and legal efforts with the city of Fresno. So let's talk about some of those that are coming up. There's a $250 million settlement over tainted drinking water against Shell Oil that just occurred, and your office was actually the one to put out the announcement about the result of that. Can you talk a little bit about the background on that case and the result from it?
Sure. Very important case. It's the biggest settlement against Shell and Dow that we know of in the nation. And so this relates to contaminated groundwater, contaminated drinking water. Really this goes back to the 1940s and 50s when Shell and Dow were selling fertilizers that contained a contaminant called TCP that seeped into our groundwater over the years. And so in the 1970s and 1980s, when the science became available, we discovered that it was essentially a carcinogen that would end up in our drinking water and in people's bodies. There were efforts made to mitigate some of that damage. And so this case goes back to 2007, I believe. I was in college in 2007, so that sort of gives you a sense of how long this litigation has lasted. So with that settlement, what we're going to be able to do is to address the 30 or so wells that have been contaminated over the years, and just to assure your viewers, those wells have been taken offline, and so the drinking water that you're drinking is safe. And so we're going to be able to mitigate the damage through a process. And I think that the real world impact for the taxpayer and for residents of Fresno is, essentially the more wells we bring online, it means the more water that we have, and in essence could drive down the costs of water for residents.
I want to move on to another landmark case recently where you're putting businesses and companies on notice about wage theft. And I know that this has been an issue that the City Council has sought to deal with. How is this setting precedent, not only in the city of Fresno, but is it setting precedent elsewhere throughout the state and nation with some of the work that you're doing there? Could you talk a little bit about that effort?
Sure. I'd like to start out by saying that when I became city attorney, one of the things that I told the council I was going to do is to engage in more partnerships with other agencies, and so this is an example of us doing that. And so we're working very closely with the state labor commissioner. She's created a task force amongst major cities in California to tackle this very important issue. As you mentioned, Fresno is the first city in the state of California to implement this program. At the beginning of this year, we received a large grant, $720,000 in May, to bring this unit online. We're going to be able to hire additional attorneys, investigators, to go after folks that have taken advantage of people that work hard every day. And so my message to the business community, who I know have concerns about maybe being wrongfully targeted, if you're doing the right thing, you don't have anything to worry about. If you are making simple accounting mistakes, you don't have anything to worry about. We're really going after bad actors who have systemically targeted working people that go to work every day, they clock in and they clock out, people who deserve to have their entire paycheck.
You know, that's definitely an interesting point, because I wanted to ask about what your message was to the business community. And so I think that, you know, overall that sort of kind of points out where this effort is really headed. I do want to talk a little bit about also the Cannabis Administrative Prosecution Program, or CAP. What are this program's goals, and how does it seek to achieve, you know, them long term, I guess? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yet another program that that is new to the City Attorney's Office. It was an effort that myself and California Attorney General Rob Bonta undertook and announced almost a year ago today, to partner together to go after smoke shops, hookah lounges, folks who sell tobacco that illegally sell cannabis. I have nothing against the lawful consumption and selling of cannabis, but what we're doing here is to target the bad actors who are creating a black market that in turn hurts the legitimate cannabis industry, and in turn hurting Fresno's tax base. And so what we're doing is to make sure that we go after the folks that are, number one, targeting children. A lot of these smoke lounges and tobacco shops are popping up within a quarter mile of schools. And we've gone into these locations and we've discovered a number of illicit activities, illegal weapons, people with warrants, products that are designed to target kids. And so it's really important for us as a city attorney's office to do our best to curb that illegal activity.
Thank you for that. Up next, we'll talk a little bit more about some of the efforts that are going on in the city attorney's office. This is the Maddy Report. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Mr. Janz, let's talk about some of your achievements as city attorney. And, you know, one of those things I want to talk about, we sort of alluded to this earlier, was, you know, housing. There's a lot of work going on around housing. Could you talk a little bit about the Tenant Protection Act, and what does that entail?
Yeah, again, another program that we're working with state officials on. We were one of, again, the first offices, agencies in the state to launch this program to ensure that tenants can stay in their homes. This is one of the best ways to prevent, in my opinion, homelessness, tackling the problem before it starts. And so what we do is go out and we've created a forum online where people can come in and submit their applications if they need help. We have a good, strong legal team that will assist tenants who are on the verge of eviction and make sure that their rights are protected, and do everything that we can to make sure that they can stay in their homes, them and their families.
You know, speaking on housing and on that topic, I know that, you know, homelessness is a big issue on a lot of people's minds. And so the city of Fresno is announcing anti-encampment rules. How does this tie into, you know, state and federal law? Are there any recent, you know, court cases that sort of spurred this action? And what do you see as the, not only the consequences, but what do you see playing out from these rules that the city is introducing?
Yeah, sure. And I think for the benefit of your viewers, it's important to understand that the city attorney's office, we don't drive policy at the city, right? And so, as I mentioned before, we report to a city council. We do legal advice for the mayor and the city manager. And so they're the real drivers of policy. And so it's our job as the city attorney's office to implement what they see as a benefit to the community. And so, to go back to your question, we had a Supreme Court decision called Martin v. Boise that, in a lot of people's minds, prevented local governments and municipalities from being able to address partially the homelessness issue, but also being able to keep our parks, our freeways, our canal embankments, railroad tracks, keeping those areas safe. And so with a new opinion that's come down in the last couple of months called Grants Pass, it lifted a lot of those restrictions, giving back a lot of power to local governments. And so you see the Governor Newsom issue executive order saying, hey, his agencies are going to begin making sides of the freeways and railroad tracks and areas within state jurisdictions safe. You've seen him give directives to cities and counties, hey, if you don't start cleaning up these areas, you're going to potentially lose state dollars. And so there's an impetus there to make sure that we sort of fall in line with the directives that we've received.
You made an important distinction at the beginning of that answer with you don't drive policy, right? You're there just to simply give a legal aspect and look at it from a legal standpoint. Are there any legal concerns from your standpoint about where unhoused people will go? Is that something that the city is looking at, or are you able to talk a little bit about that at all?
Sure, I can talk a little bit about that. I think one thing that's been lost in this conversation, especially recently, and I think that I can speak on behalf of at least the council members that were supportive of this initiative, and that this conversation about lifting some of the requirements, because remember before, you couldn't move somebody off of a park bench or off of a sidewalk or out in front of a school unless there were sufficient number of beds in that city for the entire unhoused community. And so lifting that restriction really, I think in a lot of people's eyes, and especially law enforcement, really gave a new tool to local law enforcement and folks who have been, and even not in law enforcement, folks have been addressing the unhoused issue. And so that needs to be looked at in context of all of the other great things that the city and the state are doing in terms of providing resources. The state, hundreds of billions of dollars, right? The city of Fresno, over $100 million since 2019. And so I would urge and caution folks not to look at this one ordinance in a bubble, but look at it in terms of everything else that we're doing. And at the end of the day, kids and their parents, they have a right to enjoy these public spaces, sidewalks, parks, schools, just as much as everyone else does. And so this really isn't, in my view, a targeting of any one population, because somebody could fall under this ordinance if they were, obviously an unhoused person or a drunk college student. And so we want to make sure that folks are aware that this is a law that applies to everybody equally.
Thank you. We'll be right back after this break. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back to the Maddy Report. Mr. Janz, thanks again for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate it. We were talking earlier about the distinction between the city attorney's office is not, driving public policy, but is really helping advise, providing legal advice to the city council, to, the city manager, to the mayor. But I still want to ask you, what do you see on the horizon as some of the big issues that are facing the city of Fresno, and how do you work closely with the city council and the mayor's office on some of those issues?
Well, what I would say, just from a legal perspective, what we've seen with this mayor and this city council in particular is that they're very engaged, they're very active. Not to speak ill of any other prior mayor or council, but they are uniquely engaged in the ongoings of the community. And so we've seen an unprecedented number of new ordinances and policies and initiatives And I really believe that we're going to continue to see that within the next couple of years, especially through Mayor Dyer's term into 2028. So that's going to create it's going to create some work for our office, and so we're going to be in a position to have to prepare, for that situation. One of the things that we're looking at is a bill that's working its way through the legislature to allow city attorneys' offices to prosecute misdemeanors. And so that's important for the city of Fresno because we've seen a large amount of complaints about smash and grabs, low-level petty crimes, porch piracy, that sort of thing. And those are cases that are typically and historically misdemeanors. And so if that opportunity arises, if the bill is passed and the governor signs it into law, that would create a new responsibility for the city attorney's office. And I think it would actually also probably help the district attorney's office so they could focus on the more serious and violent crimes.
What's the likelihood of that becoming law at this point? I mean, where is it at in the legislative process, if you know? And then also, I guess, would you then seek to expand your office? Would it add another department or another division to be able to prosecute those crimes? How would that work? From a department head standpoint, I'm going to absolutely follow the direction of the council, but that's not. It doesn't mean that I'm going to give my input. If we can be team players in this community, I think the average voter, the citizen, doesn't care, which government agency takes care of what problems, just as long as the problem is addressed. So I think that that's a big thing. I'm all about making sure that the city attorney's office has the resources it needs to go out and do its job. But again, it needs to be a team effort, and whatever that looks like, we'll take it as it comes. But in terms of the bill, I think it's moving along pretty quickly. I'm pretty confident that it'll pass. Now, before we wrap up the program today, which I really appreciate you taking the time to come on, the Maddy Institute is really seeking to, highlight the bipartisan nature of working relationships in the legislature among policymakers, and that was really something that Ken Maddy was known for in his legacy. It's really interesting, and I want to end with this question because you actually ran as a candidate for mayor against Mayor Dyer. Now you work very closely with the mayor, and it seems like seemingly pretty well. How does that relationship work? And do you work well together? And I guess what are some of are there any challenges that come out of that? No, you bring up a good point. I mean, our offices are just a few doors down from each other, and so we see each other every day. And if you would have asked me 4 years ago, or told me 4 years ago that we'd be down the hall from each other, I would have just laughed and shook my head. But yeah, it's no secret that he's a Republican and I'm a Democrat. But we've been able to work well together, find common ground on a lot of issues. Obviously, remembering at the end of the day that he's my client and I have to provide him with the legal advice. But I don't think that our relationship, mine and Jerry's, is unique at City Hall. If you've been following anything that's been going on this year, you're going to see Councilmember Bredefeld, who's also a Republican, who's awesome to work with, by the way, work well with the other council members. And I think that he's co-sponsored a historic number of ordinances and policies and legislation over the last year with non-Republicans, with Democrats. And so, that's one of I think the great things about local government is that we're all very problem focused, and at the end of the day, your party affiliation, takes second place to doing what's in the best interest of the people that you work for. Well, that's all the time we have today. Mr. Janz, thank you so much for coming on the program. No problem. My pleasure. Thanks for having me. Thank you for tuning into the Maddy Report. To learn more about the Maddy Institute, please visit maddyinstitute.com. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.com.